Well, Tom and Gavin and friends, thank you very much for the warm welcome. And actually, I was very taken with the some of the photographs, some of which are not in my photographic archive. And so, if you've got them online, I'd be very, very glad to see them. I begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land of which we meet, and look forward to a closer and closer involvement of our First Nations people in the Constitution sometime before long. I was really very honoured when Tom invited me to launch this important work, exceptionally interesting, an important research archive about the contribution of Australia to science and innovation. The timing of this launch is very significant when Australia is at the crossroads and still hesitant about which direction to go in. And since Tom referred to my early experiences as Minister, I might divert from my written text, which I'll inflict on you anyway some way, but to say something about how I became involved in my role as Minister for Science. My background was in, I did law and arts at Melbourne University, and my interest first was really in the history and philosophy of science. But then I became increasingly interested in meeting and talking to scientists, understanding the whole scientific process. And in the 1983 election, I was then the Shadow Minister for the Environment and also the Shadow Minister for Science. But when, after the government was elected and Hawke handed out portfolios, I had about a 30-second interview with Hawke, one of my longer experiences, and I found I was Minister for Science and the environment option simply wasn't mentioned. But I had read very widely about science, and I was trying to get my head around a lot of the big issues that were coming up, because I've been the Shadow Minister for Science. And for example, I was very much interested in the development in the understanding of DNA and of molecular biology and its structures. So, if you wanted to talk about DNA, well, why not go over to the United States and talk to Francis Crick? So I did go over to talk to Francis Crick, and we developed a relationship, and he was very helpful to me in a whole variety of ways. If you wanted to know about the information revolution, why not go over to America and talk to Claude Shannon, who'd been an absolutely fundamental figure. So it meant that within the Parliament, I could say that I was the best informed person on scientific issues, but that didn't mean very much, because no one else wanted to be in that area. And there was something about me, and I think in part it was the success of Sleeper's Weight. I think there's something about that Hawke found profoundly irritating. And so the result is that while I certainly admired his capacity, and his capacity to master a brief was quite extraordinary. I've never come across anyone who had that ability to master a brief and to analyse it on the run. But it meant that very often, when issues were coming up, I often got a very dubious response, or a very unhelpful response. And one of my colleagues said to me that the problem was that Hawke sees himself as being like the pilot of an airplane, and the radar is down, and there's fog everywhere, and at any minute they think they might crash into a mountain. And I want to come up and talk about the theory of aerodynamics, and, which is interesting, no doubt, and could be very helpful in some ways. That if at the minute, if you're about to crash into something, any minute, it's the last thing that you want to hear. So the result is that when I was invited to do things internationally, for example, I was the first Australian minister invited to actually address a G7 summit meeting in Canada. And I thought, when I went to the Prime Minister's office, because you had to get approval for overseas travel, I thought they'd be thrilled. Well, they weren't thrilled, they were furious. Because they said, well, why him? Why is he the first one invited? And so the result is that I was denied permission, so I said, well, what if I took leave and paid for myself to go, because it was being held in Canada. And he said, oh, well, yes, I suppose they can't stop you doing that. The thing was that although I had to pay my own fare, there were 4 of my officials came with me, and they travelled first class because they were entitled to it. Because all I had to do was approve their travel, and I couldn't approve my own. But they were very kind to me, and whenever we had a fueling stop, they used to have a sort of plastic bag full of goodies from first class, which they fed me, so I didn't starve. And when I was, similarly, when there was a very important ozone layer conference in London, and Mrs. Thatcher somehow got it in her head that she wanted me to be the keynote speaker together with Al Gore. So again, I went to the Prime Minister's office and requested approval, and it was refused. So I went to the British High Commissioner in Canberra and explained what had happened, so I couldn't go. And he said, it's Mrs. Thatcher's expressed desire that you be the keynote speaker, and if she's denied, it can turn ugly. And so he said, would your Prime Minister object if we picked up the tab and paid for you, paid for your accommodation? So again, I went as a man of Margaret Thatcher's largesse, while my officials went because all they had to do was to sign a chip for them. It somehow seemed quite fair. And I remember on one occasion when I was chairing the review of the Yugoslav economy, and there was a debriefing. By a weird coincidence, Hawke happened to be in Dubrovnik at the same time with a gaggle of journalists, Australian journalists, to have an interview with the then Yugoslav Prime Minister. Anyway, they met briefly, and the Yugoslav Prime Minister said, look, I'm sorry, I'll have to cancel the meeting because I've got another commitment. The Prime Minister said, yes. He said that I've got to go to a debriefing with Barry Jones. And so he said, Barry, and there's an adjective which I forget in the middle, Jones, here in Dubrovnik. So then again, everywhere I went, it was always the wrong time, the wrong place. But one of the things I did achieve, which I'm very pleased about, was there was a strong move to break up CSIRO into component parts, so that you had a manufacturing sector which serviced the manufacturing industry, was dependent, agriculture which serviced the agricultural sector and was dependent on it. And I thought the great strength of CSIRO was the interconnectivity. I mean, as you have with the university, where you have people with diverse points of view who are interacting with each other. Look, this is completely irrelevant to what I was planning to say, and time is certainly running out. I'll say this. I mentioned earlier on that Australia is very much, I think, at the crossroads. We're a very highly sophisticated urban society that is dependent on high volume exports of raw materials. And that's usually the characteristic of a third world or developing country. And this is not an accident. Historically, it was planned that way. And successive governments encouraged it, and investors gave their highest priority to mining and property. And it's interesting, if you look at the AFR's, the 200 richest, if you take the 10 wealthiest billionaires, you can see that a majority of them are either in property or in mining. But you do have a slightly increasing number of people who are involved in technology, like Cannon Brooks and Farquhar, for example, are good examples. Australia's spectacular failure in elaborately transformed manufactures has inevitably led to an over-reliance on fossil fuels for export income, adding to the risk of irreversible climate change. About 10 major export earners, all but 2 are raw materials or concentrates: iron, coal, natural gas, gold, aluminium, beef, petroleum and copper. The only exceptions, of course, foreign tourists and overseas students. That was going well, and then COVID came along. The criticism that Donald Horne made in The Lucky Country in 1964, that we think of Australia as a quarry and a farm, still has some validity, almost 60 years on. And people say, well, where would we be if we had only the resources of Israel, Sweden, or Finland? Harvard University's Centre for International Development publishes an authoritative Atlas of Economic Complexity based on the premise that economic development requires the accumulation of productive knowledge and is used in both more and more complex industries. Countries improve their economic complexity index by increasing the number of complexity of the products they successfully export. If you take Australia, in 1995, we ranked 55. In 2020, we rank 91. Japan remains first in both categories in both those years. And you can see that there's a dramatic increase in countries like, for example, Vietnam, which has gone from 107 to 52. New Zealand is well ahead of us. China has moved from 46 to 17. Because Australia has chosen to be primarily an exporter of high volume raw materials and refuses to seize the opportunities arising from transitioning to a post-carbon economy, which will create highly sophisticated export industries, our ECI is falling. We have the skill to reverse this, but I'm not sure that we have the will. The good news for Australia is we're still ahead of Ethiopia and Papua New Guinea. Government support for STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics disciplines is welcome, but there's no overarching plan to develop new industries capable of driving the transition to a post-carbon economy. And until recently, all government rhetoric harks back to the 1980s. The problem is that the digital revolution changed everything. If every citizen has the potential to master the universe through a device in his or her hand, we might reasonably expect an unprecedented level of informed public discourse and a determination to solve the great challenges to civilization, our habitat, and the planet itself. But it hasn't worked out that way. An unexpected result of providing low-cost access to the big wide world has been the rise of populism and identity politics, in which expertise is dismissed or derided. Far from heralding a new renaissance or age of enlightenment, the transition from computers to internet, worldwide net, has had a downside. Confirmation bias, cherry picking of information. Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Boris Johnson, Scott Morrison, Jair Bolsonaro, Rodrigo Duterte, Silvio Berlusconi, the revival of religious fundamentalism, the cult of the personal, exponential increases in gambling, drug use, conspicuous consumption of obesity, racism, and suspicion of the other, and a distinct anti-science basis. If anything, recent decades have been marked by the fragmentation of knowledge linked to individual experience and short-term needs. Now every user could be his, her own expert and seek the variety of truth that best suits them. I want to say something briefly about the great political crossover. Education levels and cultural affinities, rather than income and economic security, are becoming the major determinants of how people vote and whether they define themselves as progressive or conservative. The French economist Thomas Piketty, in his very important book Capitalism and Ideology, analysed voting patterns in the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Australia. In the UK in 2015, many of the poorest electorates voted to leave the European Union, of which they knew little, while the most affluent and productive voted to remain. In the US in 2016 and again in 2020, Donald Trump won an overwhelming majority of the poorest counties, whereas Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden won the best educated and the most affluent. Australia's most significant social, economic, cultural and political division is no longer between the traditional political parties, but between graduates and non-graduates, about a 50-50 split among voters. Tertiary educated professionals, many with high incomes, are becoming radicalised. Blue-collar workers, especially self-employed tradies, are becoming more conservative. Surgeons in Marlborough are becoming more radical, and carpenters in Ringwood are becoming more conservative. The same-sex plebiscite in 2017 was a striking indicator of this crossover. Kooyong had a yes vote of 73.7%, 86% participation, while Blaxland, Paul Keating's old seat, had a 26% yes vote, 75% participation. Of the 17 seats with a no majority, 11 were very safe for the ALP. In the US, Trump was extraordinarily effective in harvesting the rage of angry white males. This had several elements: the disappearance of many traditional work forms, the threat to patriarchy by feminist activism, the speed of technological change. Elites were attacked as condescending for using evidence, statistics, expertise to tell people how they should live, including eating, drinking, gambling, entertainment, what vehicles they should drive, waste disposal, having greater respect for women and girls, restricting gun ownership, and how they understood and interpreted the world. There was also dog whistling on race, refugees, and the other generally. Trump had some impact in Australia, especially on the fringes, with angry, alienated voters, perhaps up to 10%. But in a close electoral context, that 10% can be decisive. Opinion and feeling has become more powerful than evidence and experience. Witness the powerful reaction by anti-vaxxers and climate change denialists. Reliance on social media as the principal source of information creates an echo chamber effect with a unique capacity to spread misinformation unchallenged. The most encouraging sign is that professionally qualified people who used to be disengaged and voted with pegs on their noses are now playing an active role, recognising that existing hegemonic parties have a very small, moribund faction-driven membership. Voters proved to be more interested in the destination than the vehicle and put far more emphasis on seeking solutions to wicked problems such as climate change, corruption and integrity, gender issues, foreign policy and national identity. The issue of securing an adequate taxation base for the long term was evaded. Freedom has been used as a rallying cry by dissenters who rage against the concept that political, economic and social decisions ought to be based on evidence, analysis and reasoned debate, and assert that private judgment, essentially based on feeling and opinion, should have priority. Laws, regulations or court decisions based on evidence or expertise are rejected as elitist, regressive, and denying basic personal liberty, the freedom to insist that 2 and 2 equals 5. And Australia has become the most secretive of all Western democracies, far more so than the US or UK. The appalling secret trial now called off of Bernard Collaery could never have happened in Washington or London. It was not for threatening national security, it was for causing national embarrassment and humiliation, for exposing the appalling behaviour of the previous government in spying on a friendly state to profit an Australian company. Collaery was not allowed to know all the charges against him, and even now he's forbidden to answer certain questions about the case. Involvement in war is entirely secret in Australia, unlike the US, UK or Canada, where the legislature is involved, but not here. There are subjects we just don't talk about: gambling, junk food, obesity, racism, increasing inequality. But we're opening up about domestic violence, suicide and mental health. We're starting to talk more honestly about our history, and the proposed referendum on the voice to Parliament is extremely important. It's possible that the total number of Indigenous killed in massacres and frontier wars is about equivalent to the number of deaths of Australian service personnel in World Wars I and II in Korea, Vietnam and Afghanistan. I can't speak at any greater length, or you'll be here all night. You know that politicians might give them an opportunity to listen to talk to a willing audience. But I'll say this volume, this collection that you have is the work of profound scholarship and effort, an effort by volunteers. And the role of volunteers is very important, and I was saying to Gavin McCarthy earlier, I'm very happy to help if I can. There are a few tweaks that I can suggest for the areas, and a few areas where perhaps there might be some complaint that there's some underrepresentation of chemists, of astronomers, and some other disciplines. Even it's a revelation to find that there are some other states in the Commonwealth, and perhaps they deserve the occasional reference there. But it's a great collective effort, and Swinburne and its associated entities has played a very important. I congratulate everyone who's worked on this project, and it's my great pleasure and pride even to declare it launched.